Good afternoon. Let us talk about poetry. More specifically, about a collection of poetry, Ariel by Sylvia Plath. So Sylvia Plath died young, I think she was 30, and she left behind a compilation of poems that went together into her masterpiece, as they say, Ariel. They were unpublished, and they were compiled together by her husband, and a couple of years later they became published. This publication garnered worldwide acclaim, the internet tells us, and the collection showcases the beloved poet's brilliant, provoking, and always moving poems, including Ariel. So let's talk about Sylvia Plath, who wrote these poems. She was an American poet and author, and she was born in the 30s. I can't remember where in America. And she is very well known and often credited with being a postmodern poet who advanced the confessional poetry genre. So that, the internet tells us, is a style of poetry which emerged in the United States of America in the late 50s, early 60s, and it's a form of poetry in which the I becomes important, unlike previous forms of poetry, say T.S. Eliot, where the poet was neutral about events. In confessional style, it's all about I, my feelings, my relations, my internal world. And that is my interpretation of it. So disclaimer, I have never studied literature at any level. I somehow managed to do a year 12 certificate without ever even doing English. I have no English background. All I know about poetry is, as people say, I know what I like. Well, I do know what I like, but I am willing to work on liking new things, and that's what I'm doing with Sylvia Plath. So Sylvia Plath received a Pulitzer Prize in 1982, making her the fourth person to receive this honor posthumously, and I think she received it for this, though it might have been for her collected poetry. I don't think it was for her only novel, The Bell Jar, which was published just before her death. I did read The Bell Jar when I was in my teens. I found it deeply, profoundly meh. I didn't particularly dislike it. I didn't hate it. I didn't particularly like it. I felt it was an accurate description of mental illness, which is the other thing about Sylvia Plath and her confessional poetry that seems to be a main theme. When Plath's poetry came out, talking about mental health, suicide, depression, all of those things was very much a no-no, as well as that whole confessional I standard. You didn't talk about those things in polite company, and you certainly didn't talk of, if you were a woman, you certainly didn't talk about not wanting to be a member of the domestic goddess style. You had to love your husband and your children and your home and domesticity. And Plath definitely was fairly iconic in turning that around, revoking this idea that a woman has to be this particular model. I don't think she was alone in that. I think her era was very much turning that around. So I certainly respect the things that she achieved there. The Bell Jar, I didn't love it, and I've read some poetry of hers ever since. I've never loved it. It doesn't speak to me personally, but I keep on reading it, and I recently purchased this edition because so many people have felt so intensely about this. I feel like I'm missing out on something. I feel like I want to know what it is. And I think reading this book, I have finally started to see what it is. So Faber Modern Classics is all about bringing out classics anew, and this edition comes with a photograph of Sylvia Plath in London, I do believe, on the cover. She went to London on a Fulbright scholarship, and it was there that she met her husband, Ted Hughes, who was also a poet and author. The picture is credited to the Lilly Library, Indiana. Now in this book we've got, I think it's about 80 poems, and I read through them with this new method that I've been trialing. I've got the book sitting there. I will read one in the morning, maybe one in the evening, but not more than one or two a day. So I don't binge on them. I don't read so many poems that they all meld together. I read one, I sit on it, I think about it for a while. And it was tough because I've always found Plath's poetry to be erratic. It has this strong imagery that is clearly tied to an emotional narrative, but the emotion didn't trigger any emotional familiarity in me, and the images to me seemed disjointed, erratic, and largely unenjoyable. However, it's been very, very iconic for many people. So I was probably more than halfway through this book when I suddenly figured out how I can read Sylvia Plath and get it. Now, does anyone remember it was in the 90s that there was this trend for these 3D prints? It was just random dots, but if you stared at it and you disconnected your eyes or whatever, all of a sudden this image, 3D image, would come out of it. Well, I could never get those images. I tried for months. Me and my ex used to sit there staring at them, trying all sorts of weird eye tricks to get it. I finally got it. It was when I'd been up all night. I was waiting for a ferry at a terminal. I was so dazed and tired that I literally could not focus my eyes. And all of a sudden, I'm not focusing at this image on the wall, and all of a sudden a whale or a ship, I think it was a ship, suddenly came out of it. So that's what it needed. Do not sleep all night. Be completely and utterly haze, and you can see 3D. Turns out that a similar technique worked for me with Sylvia Plath's poems. After weeks and weeks of reading them and thinking, this is like Nostradamus, it is utterly meaningless. How can people find meaning in this? Finally, I had a late dinner, I had a glass of Shiraz with it, and then I had another glass of Shiraz afterwards. And all of a sudden, I read The Hanging Man and I got it. That trick had turned in my brain, and I could suddenly see where the imagery works. So The Hanging Man is on page 65, and it reads, "By the roots of my hair some god got hold of me. I sizzled in his blue vaults like a desert prophet. The night snapped out of sight like a lizard's eyelids, a world of bald white days in a shadeless socket. A vulturous boredom pinned me in this tree. If he were I, he would do what I did." Now, there's no denying that reading this poetry, it rolls off the tongue beautifully. You've got some really strong images there, like blue vaults, like a desert prophet. All of these images are strong, they're clearly emotive, but in my head, they never connected in any meaningful way. They were just like all these dots of color thrown at a board, and I couldn't get them to connect. 2 glasses of Shiraz, that's all it took, and all of a sudden I could. I'm unclear that vulturous is actually a word, but does that matter? Not really. Now, having finally found a poem in this collection that I actually got the imagery of, I found I could read them more enjoyably. At least I have come to thoroughly respect the craft that goes into making these poems. What seemed erratic and meaningless at first actually has very studied pacing. The word choice is, I wouldn't say immaculate, but there's certainly a lot of thought and specificity has gone into creating these narratives. Do I love them? No, I still don't love them. I don't breathe in this poetry and feel it is an emotional experience, though apparently many people do. One of the interesting things about this book is that when it was republished by Faber and Faber as a modern classic, I do believe they rearranged the poems. One person, Joyce Carol Oates, claims that this is the most memorable of Sylvia Plath's incantatory poems. Incantatory? Okay, sure, whatever. You do you. There's also a quote from her daughter, Frida Hughes, who now lives in West Australia and is an artist. Also, I believe, an author. I think she's painted and written children's books. I could be wrong about that. Frida's always has issued a number of comments about her mother, about her father, and occasionally about both. And she's always managed to toe the line between being judgmental in any way, which is where we get into the more controversial elements of Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath is described as prolific by many websites. I don't see that she's prolific. I don't see it. She wrote poems. She wrote quite a few, but not prolific. She wrote one novel that was published, one novel I believe that never was published, and a couple of collections of poetry. I get that she was influential. I really don't quite get why she was as influential as she was. It seems to me that a large number of the people to whom this poetry instantly spoke were women who were experiencing the same type of background that she was. That's fine. And it's good that they've finally had someone to speak for them. But when you read up on Plath, you don't hear that much about her career or her art. You hear far more about her troubled background. As a child, her father died early. She immortalized really mixed, strange feelings about him and that whole thing in a number of poems, including a couple of poems in this collection. She struggled with depression her whole life. She had numerous suicide attempts, the last one of which succeeded, if you can call it that. And she died by inhalation of gas, as I understand it, with her 2 children sleeping upstairs. Though she very carefully, according to one source on the internet, taped their doors so that no gas would get into them. After she died, the poems that make up Ariel were found as a collection on her desk, and they were rearranged and finally published, I think a couple of years after her death, by her husband, Ted Hughes. So it seems that an awful lot more about Sylvia Plath that is described is her struggle with mental illness, her depression, her multiple suicide attempts, her unhappy life. And the one thing that really does come through in reading this poetry is that this person was depressed. This person was struggling with mental illness. The main thing that I felt throughout this book is an intense sorrow at the unhappiness behind that life. This opinion too is controversial because there are websites out there that claim that Ted Hughes, her husband, edited these poems to highlight this descent into madness and towards suicide rather than the joy and love of life that her more devout fans think this collection should be about. I'm unclear how anyone could read it that way, but like I said, I am not greatly dedicated to Sylvia Plath's writing, and moreover, I don't know that much about poetry, really. I only know what I read. I know what I like. So yes, if you look her up online, you've got huge amounts of upbringing, college years and depression. Apparently she was always a brilliant student, which is how she got the Fulbright scholarship, which took her to London where she met Ted Hughes. And that's another reason why I'm reading this book now. I just last year finished Ted Hughes' collection of poetry, birthday letters. The very first time I read Ted Hughes, it struck me to my soul. This is poetry that speaks directly to my emotions through my brain, sometimes not stopping at the brain, going straight to the feelings. And it sounds like the two of them had a very dramatic and tempestuous relationship. They married after they'd only known each other for about 4 months, and they travelled around the world as detailed in poetry from this book before finally winding up somewhere in England where Sylvia Plath threw herself into 1,000 projects, including beekeeping. There's a couple of poems in here about beekeeping, which is interesting and random. There seems a frantic, frenetic level of energy. It's like you're learning 3 languages and you're beekeeping and you're housekeeping. And there's also that element of career and family. Now then, her husband left her for his mistress, and I don't know if that's what motivated the suicide. I think Sylvia Plath had tried to suicide so many times, it was only a matter of small details as to when she did that. But her life at that point is framed through the domesticity that she'd fallen into and which she had rebelled against so strongly in previous writings. So there's a lot there about it that's interesting. Sylvia Plath herself is interesting. The things she produced, I feel, less so than her actual story. At the end of the day, I think it's a tragic story of a poet and an author who has touched many, many people. And for me, the greatest tragedy has got to be that I can't quite get it to touch me the way it's touched other people. But then again, those people seem to have been largely coerced into an almost slave-like domesticity that doesn't suit them, and many of them seem to suffer from depression themselves. So maybe I should just accept that it's just as well that I don't get Sylvia Plath as much as I get the beauty of The Shadow Fox, for example. Anyway, thank you for listening to me talk about poetry. Read good books, including good poetry books, if that's your jam. Bye.